Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a historic best of 3 tier list video. So, in case you missed it, yesterday I put out a really big announcement basically saying that I'm no longer going to be working with MTG Zone, and I'm going to be moving forward with Patreon. So if you want to support the channel, that's definitely the best way to do it. And to tie in with the launch of the Patreon, I put out this really big historic best of 3 tier list and metagame guide. So this is completely free. I'll have a link to it down in the description in case you haven't seen it yet, but there's a ton of information here. It's over 25,000 words in total. Every single deck on the tier list has its own dedicated page with a summary of the deck, a deck list, strengths and weaknesses, and how you can tweak and approach each matchup against all of the other top decks in the tier list as well. So if you haven't seen this yet, I'll have a link to it down in the description. Really hope you find it useful. And then additionally, before I move on to the tier list, I also launched my own Discord server yesterday as well. So if you haven't joined that yet and you use Discord, definitely check it out. We've already got a bunch of people in there, and I'd love to grow the community as well. So definitely feel free to check that out. I'll have a link to it down in the description. But this tier list, I don't really explain why. I've got decks where they are in the list. I don't really explain the rankings. I just sort of go in detail about the decks and how you could potentially play them and tweak them. So that's what I'm going to be covering in today's video, basically explaining why I have each deck where it is on the tier list. And now before I get into ranking these 14 decks here, I do want to quickly address that this obviously isn't going to cover every single historic deck, because there's a bunch of decks that have been impactful in the past but have kind of fallen out of favour over the past few months. Stuff like Mono Green Devotion and Is It Wizards and Boris Belcher, for example, which I think would probably all fall under tier 4 if I had it on here, but I think there are so many older decks that would fall under that same category, and I don't think any of them are really having a big impact in the current metagame, so I don't really think it's worth talking about those at the moment. And then there are also a few new decks as well that are still kind of finding their feet. I think the two that come to mind for me are Fight Rigging and the Fear of Change Birthing Ritual decks, which I think are very interesting, but I still think it's early days. I still don't think the best versions of those decks have been figured out yet, and they haven't really solidified their place in the metagame yet, so it's pretty difficult to try and rate them. So I'm just going to be talking about these 14 here, which I consider to be the core of the metagame at the moment. But definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's any decks that you think deserve to be included in the core here that I've left out. It'd be interesting to chat about that. But anyway, let's just get straight into it. Starting off here with Boros Auras, which is a deck that I'm putting straight into tier 3. I think there are just too many interactive decks that are viable right now for this to really succeed. Now, Auras does have some tools to be able to fight against interactive decks. Mother of Runes is obviously a pretty big one, but I do think there are enough good combo decks in the format as well, where running Mother of Runes instead of Thought Partition will really make you worse against decks like Ruby Storm and Samwise, for example, so it's not really an easy swap to be able to do that. And then the other card that is being run at the moment to try and make them resilient to interaction is a Danto Vanguard, which I do think is probably the best option in the main deck, because like I said, there are a ton of interactive decks that are viable right now. You've got Dimir Frog, Jan Midrange, Orzhov Blink, Esper Ketramos. I'd say Is It Phoenix is also a fairly interactive deck as well. So I think a Danto Vanguard is probably the best main deck choice right now, but it's pretty awkward that a lot of the best interactive decks are in white. You know, Orzhov Blink and Esper Ketramos have really picked up in popularity ever since they added the fast mana to the format, because they get to run Deafening Silence and Rest in Peace in the sideboard, which is very good against Phoenix and Ruby Storm, and they get to run Fragment Reality as one of their main pieces of interaction, which completely bypasses the Danto Vanguard Indestructible. Same sort of thing with High Noon, they also get access to that as well as Dismember, and so I just don't feel like Auras really has enough good tools to improve the interactive matchups, and I feel like the interactive matchups are pretty common right now, so it's just a pretty hostile environment for Auras in general. I don't think it's the best choice right now, personally. Then next up, Is It Phoenix? And for me, this one goes straight to the top of tier 1. I think this is the best deck in the format for quite a few reasons. So first of all, I think you're incredibly resilient to interaction. Creature removal does basically nothing against the deck because both of your threats are recoverable from the graveyard. Discard spells are very ineffective because you have so much redundancy for your cantrip and draw effects that there really aren't that many great targets. And then similarly, counter spells don't really have any great targets either, because the Phoenix player is going to be casting 3 or 4 1-mana spells per turn. What do you effectively counter there? Maybe a Faithless Looting to stop Phoenixes, maybe a Treasure Cruise, but outside of that, there's not really good targets for your counter spells either. So you're very resilient to the interactive decks. Then secondly, you have access to some very fast starts as well off the back of Manamorphose and the Phyrexian mana spells. Getting Arclight Phoenixes back on turn 2 is difficult for any deck to race against, really, and then getting multiple Demi-Liches down can be difficult to race as well. So you can race with certain openings. And then thirdly, you get to run interaction as part of your proactive game plan, which gives you tools to be able to beat aggro and slow down the creature-based combo like Samwise and Yawgmoth as well. So to me, it feels like the only two blind spots and weaknesses of Is It Phoenix are non-creature combo like Ruby Storm and hate cards. And I think the hate cards thing, obviously there are a number of hate cards that are effective against Phoenix. You got graveyard hate like Endurance and Surgical Extraction and Rest in Peace, as well as the Storm hate cards, which are pretty popular right now, stuff like High Noon and Deafening Silence. But if we have a look at the Arena Championship metagame, I think that's probably about as hostile an environment as you can get for Phoenix, right? High Noon was the most played deck. Then you have Abzan Urborvoid on top of that, which is also main deck hate for it. The Ketramos decks were main decking Relic of Progenitus, and then the white-based mid-range decks were the most popular because they get sideboard access to Deafening Silence and Rest in Peace as well. Not to mention, basically every deck had 3 or 4 pieces of graveyard hate in the 75, and even in that environment, Phoenix still managed to put the most number of copies into the top 16, which is kind of crazy to think about. And then since then, I think the main changes to the metagame since the Arena Championship, or one of the main changes, has been the increase in popularity of Yawgmoth. And I actually think that's a benefit for Phoenix, because first of all, I feel like Yawgmoth is a pretty good matchup for Phoenix, and secondly, I think that Yawgmoth is naturally good against a lot of the decks that were being run to beat Phoenix. Decks like High Noon and Ketramos and Oars of Blink, they're all bad matchups into Yawgmoth, and so the increase in popularity of Yawgmoth has meant that decks like High Noon and Ketramos and Oars of Blink have seen less play, which I also think is a good thing for Izzet Phoenix going forwards. And obviously Phoenix does have ways to play around that hate. If the opponent does load up on Graveyard Hate or High Noon or Deafening Silence, they can board into stuff like Crackling Drake and Ral and Quantum Riddler. So I do feel like even though there is still a lot of hate in the format for Phoenix, it can play through it, which is kind of scary. And then the non-creature combo weakness, I think, is a bigger concern, right? I think the weakness to Ruby Storm is a pretty big downside for Phoenix, but you do still have some options, right? If you're willing to dedicate narrow sideboard slots, you could run stuff like Curse of Shaken Faith, for example, or I know some people were even running Soulless Jailer, which does hurt you quite a lot. But in general, only really having 1 or 2 weaknesses and being generally resilient means to me that it's just the top dog in the format. And having played a lot of the top decks, this is still the one that I have the highest win rate with at the moment as well. But it is a very difficult deck to play, which is a bit awkward. Then next up, we have Azorius High Noon, and this is a very interestingly positioned deck, and I guess this is another weakness of Phoenix that I forgot to mention, actually. Phoenix is very weak to High Noon, so the main 2 weaknesses of Phoenix outside of hate in general is to High Noon and non-creature combo like Ruby Storm. And High Noon you should think is very well positioned because 2 of the best decks in the format, Phoenix and Ruby Storm, have High Noon as their worst matchup, which is obviously a great thing for High Noon, but I don't think I can put it any higher than tier 2 personally, because first of all, it has a nightmare matchup against Dimir Frog. If the Frog opponent knows what they're doing, this is almost an unwinnable matchup from my experience, which is a pretty big downside because Dimir Frog is still quite a popular deck from my experience. But I can't put it any higher than tier 2 because it also really struggles against the Birthing Ritual decks, and with Yawgmoth winning the Arena Championship, that is definitely one deck that's increased in popularity. Similarly, it also has a pretty poor matchup into Abzan Urborvoid and Samwise because Urborvoid gets to run both Birthing Ritual and Verdant Dread, which are really difficult cards for High Noon to beat, and both Yawgmoth and Samwise get to run Birthing Ritual and Chord of Calling, and then these 2, Urborvoid and Yawgmoth, also get to run Endurance post-sideboard, which is really difficult. So I feel like even though you have great matchups against 2 of the top decks in the format, you have enough really bad matchups against decks like Dimir Frog and relatively popular decks like Yawgmoth as well, that I can't really justify putting it any higher than tier 2 personally. Then next up we have Dimir Frog, and this is another one that I'm going to put in tier 2, and I have it just below High Noon because whilst I do really like the Frog list, I think they're very consistent. I think they have some of the highest overall card quality out of any of the decks on this list. It does have some naturally bad matchups against some decks that are pretty popular right now. Like I think the Izzet Phoenix matchup is pretty bad, which is why I think some of the best performing lists from the Arena Championship were running Graveyard Hate in the main deck. Like I think Arna Hushenbeth's list was running Surgical Extraction, Soulguide Lantern, and Strategic Betrayal in the main deck to try and counteract that a little bit. And I think, more importantly, you really struggle to deal with resolved artifacts and enchantments, which is particularly an issue against Birthing Ritual, and with the increased popularity of Yawgmoth, I think that's a real issue for Dimir. Then on top of that, you obviously have Abzan Urborvoid, which is also running Verdant Dread, making it even worse. Samwise runs Birthing Ritual and Chord of Calling as well, and I think Affinity is a pretty bad matchup because you don't have any mass artifact removal either, and Ruby Storm can be a tricky matchup, although it is a little bit closer. So while I do really like the Dimir Frog lists in general because they're very flexible in terms of their interaction and the overall card quality is really high, I think having bad matchups against Phoenix, Yawgmoth, Birthing Ritual decks, and Affinity is a pretty big knock against it, so that's why I've got it in tier 2. Then next up we have Simic Eldrazi, and for me this is going to the bottom of tier 3 because whilst there are some good reasons to play Eldrazi, like I think it's really good against the counterspell decks, so it's good against High Noon and Dimir Frog, and you do have a reasonable matchup against the slower interactive decks as well. You really struggle against Ruby Storm. You know, even when they had Eldrazi Temple, the two biggest issues was fast aggro and fast combo, and so you really struggle against Phoenix, can usually outrace you, Yawgmoth, Samwise, Ruby Storm, you know, even Juns can be tricky now. You've lost some speed with Eldrazi Temple, and so if they can get Pyrogoyfs online early, they can just dome you out before you even get to stabilize properly. And so if the metagame shifts and the counterspell decks like High Noon or Dimir become much more popular, or the metagame really shifts to a much more interactive format, then I can see an argument for putting it higher. But I feel like right now, with Phoenix popular, with Ruby Storm popular, with Yawgmoth popular, you just have really bad matchups against a lot of the most popular decks in the format right now, if that makes sense. Then next up we have Is It Affinity or Affinity in general, and for me this is another tier 3 deck, but I'm going to put it above Simic Eldrazi and Boros Auras. So Affinity in Historic is kind of weird, where there's a real cost to making room for interaction in the main deck because you have so much synergy within the deck that making cuts to run something like a Metallic Rebuke or a Galvanic Blast really just reduces the range of explosive starts, if that makes sense. I really do feel like the best builds are the ones that just have 4 Weapons Manufacturing, 4 Pinnacle Emissary, a bunch of zeros, 4 Kappa Cannoneer, 4 Emery, and you just go all in on trying to maximize those explosive starts. But outside of Tormod's Crypt, which is definitely a bonus, right? I think running 4 Tormod's Crypt in the main deck does give you good game against Is It Phoenix and Jund Goyfs and Ruby Storm to a lesser extent as well. But outside of that, you don't really have that much room for interaction. And whilst you do have explosive starts, right, you can Kappa Cannoneer on turn 2, you can go Weapons Manufacturing on turn 2 into an Arcbound Ravager and start doming the opponent really quickly. On average, you do take a little while to turn the corner and close the game out. So that does mean that you're naturally weak to fast, aggressive creature decks like Boros Auras that can usually race you, or just combo decks in general, right? I think you're very weak to Ruby Storm, you're very weak to Yawgmoth, and especially Samwise that can usually kill quicker, which is a downside. And then secondly, obviously there is the more dedicated sideboard cards that just wipe out all of the artifacts, which typically in the past kind of ebb and flow in popularity. When Affinity is popular, people make room for cards like Meltdown and Fade from History. But I think the big issue for Affinity right now is that a lot of people are running cards like Divine Purge and Wrath of the Skies in the sideboard because of Yawgmoth and Samwise, and to a lesser extent, the Phoenix and Ruby Storm, right? White is a colour that is very popular in Historic right now because it gives you access to Deafening Silence and Rest in Peace, and really good hate cards against the fastest decks in the format, like Phoenix and Ruby Storm. So decks like Oars of Blink, Esper Ketramos are some of the more popular interactive decks, and those decks are naturally running Wrath of the Skies and Divine Purge to deal with Birthing Ritual and all the creatures in Yawgmoth, and Birthing Ritual and all the creatures in Samwise, and, you know, Verdant Dread and stuff in the Urborvoid matchup. So the white mass artifact removal is still seeing a good amount of play, which is a big issue. I think if the format develops and those sorts of cards fall out of favour in the sideboard, then I definitely think it is worth looking at Affinity again. And also you do tend to struggle against decks like High Noon as well. Now, this matchup is quite polarising in terms of who goes first, because if you can get your setup down before they get a High Noon in play, then you're usually going to win. But on the flip side, if you're not running Retrofitter Foundry and they get a High Noon down early, that really slows the deck down quite a lot as well. So Affinity, I do think, has potential to move up, but I think going forwards there needs to be less Divine Purge and Wrath of the Skies in the sideboard, and just less combo in the format in general, because I do think you really struggle to consistently beat decks like Ruby Storm and Yawgmoth, which are two of the more popular decks right now. Then next up we have Abzan Urborvoid. So funnily enough, this is a deck that I built, so I'll have my original deck guide video from a few months back in the description if you haven't seen that and you want to check out my original video on the deck. But this deck was built with this specific metagame in mind, right? It was built after the fast mana came out, so it was built to try and attack this metagame with consistent turn 2 Archon of Emeria to try and help against Phoenix and Ruby Storm, Verdant Dread and Birthing Ritual to give you good matchups against the interactive decks, especially High Noon, and then Skyclave Apparition and Juggernaut Peddler to interact, and Urborvoid to give you a way to close the game out. And while I do think a lot of those pieces do still work quite well in the metagame, the two big changes or the two big differences between now and then that have made me put it down into tier 3, probably above Affinity, Boros Auras and Simic Eldrazi. But the reason why I'm not as high on it anymore is, first of all, I don't think Archon of Emeria is actually that effective against Is It Phoenix because they run Chain Lightning, right? Even if you get an Archon of Emeria down on turn 2, if they have a Chain Lightning, they have an immediate answer, and then their proactive game plan will usually just go over the top of yours because you're not particularly fast at closing the game out, which is a bit of an issue. And then secondly, I think just the increase in the popularity of Yawgmoth and Samwise since the last Arena Championship is a big issue for you as well. Like I said, in terms of stopping the combo decks, you are very reliant on Archon of Emeria to do work, whereas that doesn't really work against Yawgmoth or Samwise either. So if Yawg or Sam weren't as popular, I think I would be higher on it in general. But the big issue with this deck is you rely on your hate pieces or your interaction lining up because you don't close the game out particularly well, or particularly quickly, sorry. I mean, you can have fast starts if you have ramp into an Urubroid, but you're not always going to have that. So in general, you do rely on your interaction or your hate lining up well, and I don't think you have that many great options against decks like Yawgmoth or Samwise. So those are the two reasons why I've got it down in tier 3. But if these two decks do fall off in popularity, then I do think it is worth potentially returning to, especially if the format becomes more interactive, because I think running both Birthing Ritual and Verdant Dread tends to give you a really good matchup against a lot of the interactive decks as well. Then next up we have Yawgmoth. So obviously this is the deck that took down the last Arena Championship, so it shouldn't be a massive surprise to anyone for me to put this in tier 1. And I do think Yawgmoth is very well positioned against a lot of the field, right? I think you're great against the interactive decks because you have Birthing Ritual, Chord of Calling, and Yawgmoth itself. Yawgmoth makes you naturally good against the creature decks, whether that's an aggro deck like Boros Auras or a creature-based combo deck like Samwise, for example. But the big issue for me is that the two worst matchups that Yawgmoth has, in my opinion, are Izzet Phoenix and Ruby Storm, which are, in my opinion, the two other most powerful decks in the format. So you struggle against the other best decks, but you kind of tend to wipe the floor with everyone else, is my experience, having played quite a lot of Yawgmoth recently. Now, having said that, if there's tweaks that can be made to Yawgmoth to meaningfully improve these two matchups, then I definitely think it's likely to become the best deck in the format. Like, I've recently been thinking about whether it's worth potentially splashing white in Yawgmoth to give you access to Deafening Silence post-sideboard. You could maybe run Archon of Emeria in the main deck as a Chord of Calling tutor target then, which would really help these matchups, and then that would also give you access to stuff like Juggernaut Peddler in the main deck, which would be nice against combo decks, which is probably your closest matchups outside of you're good against mid-range, you're good against creature-based combo, and so non-creature combo like Valakut can also be a bit dicey sometimes, so Juggernaut Peddler might help there. But the issue with that is that it will make the mana base significantly worse in a deck where you care about your life total, right? You'll be taking much more damage off your shock lands, and if you have to run stuff like Starting Town or Mana Confluence, that will then limit your ability to activate Yawgmoth, which is definitely a downside. And Yawgmoth still does have tools to fight these matchups, right? You can potentially main deck a card like Soulless Jailer to tutor off Chord of Calling while staying in Golgari as well. So Yawgmoth for me, the reason why it's not top is just because I feel like the two worst matchups are against two of the other best decks, which is definitely a knock for it in my opinion. Then next up we have Jund Goyfs. So this was probably the best interactive deck before the fast mana was added to the format, and I do think it has suffered since then. I think one of the big issues with Jund Goyfs is that you don't really have great options against decks like Izzet Phoenix and Ruby Storm, really. Like, you have Damping Sphere post sideboard, but that's much easier for Ruby Storm and Izzet Phoenix to play through. It does allow them to cast a couple of spells to try and dig towards an answer, and it doesn't help you proactively either. So I think not having an effective hate card against Izzet Phoenix and, the fast mana decks in general is why I don't have it as high as I did, a few months ago, for example. I still think it's tier 2, but I think it's near the bottom of tier 2, right? It is still a powerful proactive game plan, and one of the big advantages of the Goyfs deck is because of Pyrogoyf, you can turn the corner pretty quickly in general. But I think another big knock on it is it's also an interactive deck that is much easier to hate out compared to decks like Esper Ketramos or Oars of Blink, for example, because you do really get hosed by mass graveyard exile. Stuff like Rest in Peace, Relic of Progenitus is really difficult for you to deal with, and those cards are quite common right now, especially Rest in Peace, because it's great against Izzet Phoenix, it helps against Ruby Storm, it stops Yawgmoth and Samwise for comboing off as well. So I feel like the two main things holding Jund back right now is just not really an effective way to stop the fast mana decks consistently, and also the prevalence of Rest in Peace and Relic of Progenitus, right? Ketramos decks are main decking Relic of Progenitus, which is kind of a nightmare for Jund Goyfs. So if that changes, if the metagame does shift and those mass graveyard exile cards do disappear, then I definitely think I'd put it up a bit. And again, if Jund gets better tools to be able to fight against decks like Ruby Storm, then I'd put it up a bit. But right now I've got it kind of near the bottom of tier 2. Then next up we have Gruul Valakut, which is kind of an interesting list because I do feel like it's attacking from two completely different angles, right? You have the combo side of the deck, which can just win usually with 7 lands off Scape Shift because most decks run shock lands, so they're likely to be at 18 life to begin with. And then you've obviously got the fair Valakut side of things where you can just get it online manually with, you know, your Dryad of the Elysian Graves and your Ice-Till Explorers. So I do think it's naturally good against the interactive decks, but the big issue with Valakut is that you don't have great options to race against the faster decks, right? Your fastest kills are get to 7 lands and then Scape Shift, which takes a lot longer to set up than a deck like Ruby Storm or Phoenix or Yawgmoth or Samwise can do. So that's the big thing that's holding it back. I'm going to put it in tier 3, but the top of tier 3, because I do feel like there is a reason to play Valakut. If people take the hate out of the sideboards, if the interactive deck starts seeing more play, then I do think you have a good matchup against the decks using discard spells. But in general, the other big weakness of Valakut is that you do tend to struggle against the counterspell decks as well, right? High Noon and Dimir Frog can be tricky matchups as well. So I do think there are metagames where Valakut can be good, but in general, I feel like it has enough weaknesses to counter spells and to other fast combo that I can't really put it higher than tier 3 right now. Then next up we have Ruby Storm, and this is a really interesting one because this deck didn't do particularly well in the Arena Championship, but I'm still putting it in tier 1 for a few reasons. So first of all, if we just have a look at the straight matchup head-to-heads, I don't really think Ruby Storm has any bad matchups outside of decks that are main decking hate for it, right? If you have a look at it against the interactive decks, Dimir Frog is probably the closest matchup, but for the most part, Ruby Storm is pretty resilient to interaction. Discard spells and counter spells aren't that effective against the deck because it has so much redundancy. You have a ton of draw to effects with Reckless Impulse and stuff like that, so you can play through most interaction quite well. And then outside of that, most of the other decks are just fast linear decks trying to race, and Ruby Storm is just the fastest linear deck in the format as well. So you usually race if it's a head-to-head race. You can usually play through interaction. Dimir Frog can be close, but outside of that, for the most part, you can play through interaction. It's only really decks like High Noon that has main deck hate that are an issue. So the only real weakness of Ruby Storm, in my opinion, is the hate cards. And I think the reason why it did so poorly in the Arena Championship was, first of all, it wasn't that represented, but second of all, it was just an incredibly hostile environment for it in terms of hate cards, right? You had High Noon as the most played deck, which has 7 pieces of hate in the main deck. You had Abzan Uraboroid, which had Archon of Emiria in the main deck. You had a ton of decks with Graveyard hate and Storm hate in the sideboard. You had Ketramos with Relic of Progenitus. There was a much higher density of white mid-range decks in that format because they got access to cards like Deafening Silence and Rest in Peace in the sideboard. So there was a ton of hate for Ruby Storm when I think it's a deck that isn't as resilient to hate as something like Is It Phoenix. But I do think that dynamic has changed since the Arena Championship. So first of all, I think the increase in popularity of Yawgmoth has caused some of the decks that were targeting Ruby Storm to fall off in popularity as well, right? Yawgmoth is naturally strong against decks like High Noon and Esper Ketramos and Orzhov Blink, which tended to pack the most hate for Ruby Storm. So those decks dropping in popularity because Yawgmoth is more popular is definitely a good thing for Ruby Storm. But I think the biggest change since the Arena Championship is the introduction of Hex Magic, because that not only, is a power boost for the consistency and the power level of the proactive game plan of the deck, but I also think it makes the deck much more resilient to Graveyard hate, which I think is a really big deal because, like I said, one of the reasons why it struggled in the Arena Championship was because without Hex Magic, you're very reliant on Storm of Memories and Past in Flames to consistently combo off. So cards like Relic of Progenitus from Ketramos, Rest in Peace, Surgical Extraction, Endurance were effective sideboard cards to stop you going off, whereas now with Hex Magic, those sorts of cards are much less effective. So in a very, very simplistic sense, you've essentially cut the hate cards that are effective against you in half. Now again, Graveyard hate is still useful against it. There will still be some hands where you're reliant on Storm of Memories and Past in Flames, but like I said, the big weakness of Ruby Storm is its vulnerability to hate, and making Graveyard hate less effective means that you are kind of very reliant on Deafening Silence, High Noon, Damping Sphere going forwards, which a lot of decks can't run, and the decks that can run them tend to get punished by Yawgmoth as well. So that's the reason why I've got it in tier 1. I think it's the fastest proactive deck in the format, which is mainly weak to hate, and I think that hate in general has become less effective, and the decks that can run the effective hate have become less popular as well, is basically my logic here. Then next up we have Esper Ketramos, and for me this is a tier 2 deck. I'm going to put it above Jund here because I do think there are definite upsides of Esper over Jund. I think getting access to white is huge because you get access to solid hate cards for Phoenix and Ruby Storm. You also get access to cards like Wrath of the Skies, which is really effective against Affinity and the Birthing Ritual decks like Yawgmoth and Samwise as well. And I think being in 3 colours gives you good access to sideboard cards. I think Spell Snare is a very effective card in a lot of matchups. Force of Negation is a very useful card to have against decks like Valakut as well. So I do feel like it's a very flexible deck. I also feel like the quality of your proactive threats is really high as well, so you're also fairly resilient against a lot of the other interactive decks as well. But the things that are holding it back, in my opinion, is because you're running a lot of proactive threats compared to a lot of the other interactive decks, you don't have as much interaction yourself, which does mean that you're usually reliant on your sideboard cards in order to consistently win the combo matchups. And that is an issue because, you know, you're usually going to lose game 1, and post sideboard, if you don't draw your hate or the opponent happens to have an answer to it, it can be difficult to, you know, consistently beat decks like Phoenix and Ruby Storm and Yawgmoth, for example. So that's the reason why I've got it here in tier 2. I do think if the metagame shifts to more interactive decks, then I do like Esper Ketramose quite a lot, because it does tend to go slightly bigger than most of the other interactive decks, but not getting to run as much interaction itself as a result of that does hold it back against some of the more linear decks, if that makes sense. Then next up we have kind of a similar deck in Orzhov Blink, and again I'm going to put this in tier 2, but I am going to have it slightly above Esper Ketramose because I do think being slightly more low to the ground, slightly more consistent because of the cleaner mana base, and slightly less focus on going bigger than the other mid-range decks in the format does give it an edge in the current metagame, because I do feel like you're slightly more effective against decks like Phoenix and Ruby Storm because you're quicker at closing the game out, you get to run more interaction as well, which helps slow down their proactive game plan, and I also feel like being lower to the ground gives you a better matchup against decks like High Noon and Dimir Frog as well. So right now, whilst these sorts of fast combo decks and counterspell decks are some of the better decks in the format, I prefer Orzhov Blink, but like I said, if the format does kind of become more grindy and mid-rangey, I do think Esper Blink is probably the better one out of the two. And then finally we have Abzan Samwise, and this is kind of interesting because you can make a lot of comparisons with Yawgmoth, right? They're both Birthing Ritual, Chord of Calling decks with sacrifice synergies, and I do think there are some definite upsides of running Samwise over Yawgmoth. I think you have much better tools to win against Phoenix and Ruby Storm, which are Yawgmoth's 2 most difficult matchups, because you can board into Deafening Silence, you can Chord of Calling for Thalia while still keeping Lurrus, which is a pretty big deal, and then you get access to Juggernaut Peddler, which is helpful against both combo and control as well. Now, having said that, pure control doesn't really exist in the current historic metagame, or it's not particularly good anyway, but Juggernaut Peddler definitely helps against combo, and you do have a faster proactive game plan, right? Samwise does close the game out a lot quicker than Yawgmoth does, so in less interactive matchups where you're just reliant on racing, Samwise generally has a better chance as well, so I think Samwise is better against matchups like Valakut and Affinity for that reason. But having said that, I still feel like Yawgmoth is slightly favoured in these matchups. I just feel like Samwise is much more favoured, if that makes sense. But then in terms of the weaknesses, first of all, I feel like Samwise is just naturally weak to Yawgmoth itself, because it's generally easier for the Yawgmoth player to get to Yawg than it is to assemble all 3 pieces unless you have a very fast start. And if the opponent does get Yawgmoth down before you combo off, it's very easy for them to keep you off the combo for the rest of the game. But I feel like the biggest weakness of Samwise compared to Yawgmoth is it's just much weaker to interactive decks in general, right? Yawgmoth is relatively resilient to spot removal because they run a lot of 2-for-1s, and in general, they're just trying to get to Yawgmoth itself, and if they get a Yawgmoth in play, spot removal isn't really as effective because they can just sacrifice the creatures in response to draw a bunch of cards, whereas Samwise relies on assembling 3 different creatures, and if the opponent has a lot of spot removal or a lot of interaction in general, and they cut you off the combo, you're left with just kind of individually weak small creatures as well. So that's the big difference for me. Yawgmoth is just much more resilient to the interactive decks, which is what holds Samwise back. But I still think Samwise is a good deck. I'm going to put it in tier 2, just above Orzhov Blink, but just below Dimir Frog. But anyway, that's my tier list. Definitely let me know in the comments what you think, if there's anything you agree with, you disagree with, if you think I've got certain decks too high or too low. I'd love to have a discussion with you guys. Speaking of which, if you haven't joined the Discord yet, definitely go check it out. That'll be another great place where you can have discussions about this sort of thing. And then, like I said, if you haven't checked out this article, this has all of these decks in much more detail. It has their strengths and weaknesses and ways that you can potentially tweak them to improve the matchup against the other decks as well. So I'll have this link down in the description. And again, I want to plug it quickly because I only launched it yesterday. But if you do want to support me, this Patreon that I'll have linked down in the description is definitely the best way to do it. And massive, massive thanks to everyone who's subscribed so far. I really, really appreciate you. And if anyone else is thinking of doing it, it would be greatly appreciated as well. Either way, though, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.